The sound of gunfire shattered the early morning calm, sending birds flying from the cottonwoods along the creek as Florence Reynolds ducked behind an overturned wagon. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a blacksmith's hammer as bullets splintered the wood mere inches from her head. This wasn't how she had imagined her new life in Silvercreek would begin, caught in the crossfire between the cattle barons and homesteaders who had been feuding over this valley since before she'd even stepped off the stagecoach 3 days ago. Florence pressed her back against the wagon, the dust from the dry Arizona earth coating her throat as she tried to control her panicked breathing. Her blue calico dress, once pristine when she'd arrived from Boston, was now torn and smudged with dirt. The letter from her late uncle promising a peaceful inheritance of his general store seemed like a cruel joke now. "Stay down, miss." A deep voice commanded as a tall figure dove beside her, the brim of his worn Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Florence stifled a scream as the stranger landed beside her, his broad shoulders shielding her from the spray of splinters as another bullet hit the wagon. His face was partially hidden beneath several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes, clear and green as spring water, met hers with startling intensity. "Isaac Garrison," he said simply, extending a calloused hand while keeping his head low. "And you picked a mighty poor time to be taking a morning stroll, madam." "I wasn't strolling," Florence replied indignantly, accepting his handshake despite herself. "I was opening my store when these barbarians started shooting up the street." Isaac's mouth quirked into a half-smile that did nothing to diminish the alertness in his eyes. "Your store? You must be Reynolds' niece from back east. Heard you were coming." He peered carefully over the wagon's edge. "Well, Miss Reynolds, welcome to Silvercreek, where the Blackwater Ranch boys and the Valley Settlers Association have turned Main Street into their personal battleground." Another volley of gunfire erupted, and Isaac pulled Florence lower. She could smell leather and horses on him, mixed with something else, something clean like soap and pine. "We need to move," he muttered, checking the ammunition in his revolver. "This wagon won't hold much longer and we're too exposed." "Move where?" Florence demanded, clutching her torn skirts. "There are men shooting everywhere." Isaac's eyes scanned the street before settling on the alleyway between the saloon and the barber shop. "There. On my count, we're going to run. Stay low, and whatever you do, don't stop until you reach that alley. Ready?" Florence wasn't ready not for any of this, but she nodded anyway, gathering her skirts in one hand. "1," Isaac began, his voice steady. "2." Before he reached 3, the wagon shuddered violently as something heavy crashed into it from the other side. A man in dusty range clothes tumbled over the top, landing hard beside them with a revolver pointed directly at Isaac's chest. "Garrison," the newcomer snarled, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "Should have known you'd be mixing in this. Holcomb wants your head for what you did at Clear Creek." Isaac didn't flinch. "Randall, still doing Holcomb's dirty work, I see." Florence's breath caught in her throat as the standoff stretched between the two men, neither blinking nor moving. The shooting had momentarily ceased, as if the entire town was holding its breath along with her. "Drop it, Randall," Isaac said quietly. "There's a lady present." Randall's eyes flicked to Florence, momentary surprise crossing his face before twisting back into a sneer. "What's this?" The famous lone wolf Garrison finally found himself his words died as Isaac moved with lightning speed, knocking the gun upward as it discharged harmlessly into the air. The two men grappled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and curses as Florence pressed herself against the wagon wheel, searching desperately for something to help. Her hand closed around a piece of broken wagon slat just as Randall pinned Isaac beneath him. Without thinking, Florence swung the makeshift club, catching Randall across the shoulders. He yelped in surprise, his grip loosening just enough for Isaac to flip their positions and deliver a knockout punch that left Randall limp in the dirt. "Nice swing," Isaac panted, rising to his feet and retrieving his hat. He offered Florence his hand, "But we really need to move now." This time, Florence didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength in his grip as he pulled her up. For a suspended moment they stood face to face, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his green eyes. Another shot rang out, breaking the spell. Isaac tugged her forward, and together they raced across the street toward the alley, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. Florence's lungs burned, her legs pumping beneath layers of petticoats as she ran harder than she ever had in her genteel Boston life. They reached the alley's shadows just as a rider thundered past, firing wildly. Isaac pulled Florence against the rough brick wall, his body shielding hers as they both struggled to catch their breath. "You hit?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Florence shook her head, suddenly aware of their proximity, of his arm still protectively curved around her waist. "No." Nothing that won't heal." He stepped back, giving her space, though his eyes remained watchful. "We need to get you somewhere safe until this blows over. The shooting usually doesn't last long. Both sides have too much to lose." "My store," Florence began, but Isaac was already shaking his head. "Too dangerous. It's right in the middle of everything." He peered around the corner. "I've got a place just outside town. We can lie low there until the marshal gets this under control." Florence bristled. "I am not going to some strange man's home unchaperoned. I don't even know you, Mr. Garrison." Isaac's expression softened slightly. "You're right to be cautious, Miss Reynolds, but I promise you, on my honor, I mean you no harm, and right now staying in town might mean catching a stray bullet." As if to emphasize his point, glass shattered somewhere nearby, followed by angry shouts. Florence bit her lip, weighing her limited options. The proper thing would be to find the marshal or perhaps the town's minister, but Boston propriety seemed woefully inadequate for a Wild West gunfight. "Very well," she conceded reluctantly, "but I expect to return as soon as it's safe." Isaac nodded, scanning the street once more. "My horse is behind the livery. We'll need to move careful-like, stay close." They made their way through a maze of back alleys and narrow passages between buildings, Isaac's hand occasionally touching her elbow to guide her. The sounds of fighting grew more distant, though Florence could still hear occasional shots and the shouting of men. "Who are these people?" she asked as they paused behind a stack of crates. "What are they fighting about?" Isaac's expression darkened. "Water and land, mostly. The Blackwater outfit, that's Theodore Holcomb's cattle empire. They've controlled this valley for 20 years. But 2 years ago, homesteaders started coming in, setting up farms, diverting water. Holcomb sees them as thieves. The settlers see Holcomb as a tyrant. And which side are you on?" Florence asked, studying his face. Isaac met her gaze directly. "Neither, both," he shrugged. "I ride for myself these days." There was a story there, Florence sensed, but before she could press further, Isaac held up a hand for silence. They had reached the back of the livery stable, where a handsome chestnut gelding was tethered, saddled and ready. "You were prepared to leave in a hurry," Florence observed. Isaac's mouth twitched. "In my experience, it's never a bad idea to have a quick way out." He untied the horse with practiced efficiency. "His name's Copper. He's steady, won't spook at gunfire." The horse nickered softly as Isaac mounted in one fluid motion, then extended his hand down to Florence. She hesitated only briefly before gathering her skirts and allowing him to pull her up behind him. The side-saddle riding lessons of her youth had not prepared her for sitting astride a horse, especially not pressed against a strange man's back. "Hold on," Isaac instructed, and Florence tentatively placed her hands at his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. As Copper began to move, she instinctively tightened her grip. They circled wide around the town, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the shelter of trees where possible. From this vantage, Florence could see smoke rising from somewhere in Silvercreek. A fire had broken out. Her heart sank as she wondered if it was her uncle's store, her inheritance and livelihood going up in flames before she'd even properly begun. "Is it always like this?" she asked, raising her voice against the wind as they galloped across open ground. Isaac half turned his head. "No. Usually they just threaten each other. Something must have happened to set them off." The land began to change as they rode, the flat plain giving way to rolling foothills dotted with juniper and piñon pine. After about 20 minutes, a small cabin came into view, nestled against a rocky outcropping with a clear view of the valley below. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a stream burbled nearby. Isaac slowed Copper to a walk as they approached. "It isn't much," he said, something almost like apology in his voice. "But it's defensible, has clean water, and nobody bothers me here." As they dismounted, Florence, taking Isaac's offered hand for support, she surveyed the simple homestead. The cabin was small but solidly built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. A woodpile was neatly stacked against one wall, and she could see an herb garden surprisingly well tended near the stream. "You live here alone?" she asked, smoothing her rumpled skirts. Isaac nodded, leading Copper to the corral. "Just me and Copper." He began unsaddling the horse with practiced motions. "Been that way for 2 years now." Florence stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with herself in this wild, masculine space. In Boston, she had always known her place, her role in any situation. Here, all the rules seemed different. "You can wait inside if you like," Isaac offered, noticing her discomfort. Doors not locked, grateful for the direction, Florence approached the cabin. The door swung open at her touch, revealing a single room that was unexpectedly tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow bed occupied the corner, its blankets neatly folded. Shelves held provisions, books, and a few personal items. It was spare but clean, with none of the empty whiskey bottles or disorder she might have expected from a bachelor's quarters. By the time Isaac entered, having seen to his horse, Florence had removed her torn shawl and was examining a row of books with surprise. "Shakespeare?" she asked, turning to face him. "And Thoreau," a flush of color touched Isaac's tan cheeks. "Man's got to exercise his mind as well as his trigger finger out here." He moved to the fireplace, setting about starting a small fire despite the mild day. "Gets cold in these hills come evening." Florence watched him work, this contradiction of a man who quoted Shakespeare and lived alone in the wilderness. "Thank you," she said finally, "for helping me. I might have been killed if not for you." Isaac straightened, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Anyone would have done the same." "I don't think that's true." Florence moved to the table, running her fingers along its smooth surface. "You put yourself at risk for a stranger. Been in these parts long enough to know a bullet doesn't care who it hits," Isaac replied. He gestured to a copper pot. "I can make coffee if you'd like." Florence nodded, grateful for the mundane offer in the midst of such an extraordinary day. As Isaac busied himself with the coffee, she found herself studying him more closely. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was a watchfulness to him, too, in the way his eyes frequently checked the windows, in how he positioned himself to keep the door in his sightline. "How long do you think we'll need to stay here?" she asked. Isaac shrugged, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "Hard to say. These flare-ups usually burn themselves out by nightfall. Marshal Thornton generally manages to restore order, such as it is." "And then what?" Florence pressed. "They just go back to threatening each other until the next time." "That's been the pattern." Isaac set the coffee to boil. "Though things have been getting worse lately, more homesteaders coming in, Holcomb getting more desperate to hold onto what he sees as his land." Florence sank into one of the chairs. "And my uncle's store sits right in the middle of it all." "Reynolds General Mercantile," Isaac nodded. "Your uncle, he sold to both sides, didn't take positions, just provided what folks needed, made him neutral territory of sorts." "Is that why they were fighting there today? Because it's, what did you call it, neutral territory?" Isaac leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. "Possibly, or maybe they were fighting over something else entirely, and that's just where it broke out." He studied her face. "You really didn't know what you were walking into, did you?" Florence shook her head, feeling a mix of anger and foolishness. Uncle Gilbert's letters mentioned tensions between ranchers and farmers, but nothing about open warfare in the streets. She twisted her hands in her lap. "I thought. Well, after my parents died last year, and then the offer from the bank where I worked was rescinded when they discovered I was a woman." "You thought Silvercreek offered a fresh start," Isaac finished for her. "Yes." Florence looked up at him. "Is that so foolish?" "No," he said softly. Not foolish at all. The coffee began to boil, breaking the moment. Isaac turned away to tend to it, pouring 2 cups and offering one to Florence. She accepted gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "So," Isaac said, taking the seat opposite her, "what will you do now?" Florence sipped her coffee, finding it surprisingly good, strong but not bitter. "I don't know. I suppose that depends on whether I still have a store to return to." She set the cup down with determination. "But I didn't come all this way to turn back at the first sign of trouble." A ghost of a smile touched Isaac's lips. "No, I don't imagine you did." They fell into a surprisingly comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of birds outside. Florence found herself wondering about the man across from her, what had brought him to this solitary existence. Why he stood apart from the factions that divided the valley, what sorrows or secrets he carried that kept his hand so close to his gun. But before she could find a polite way to ask, a sound outside caught Isaac's attention. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, gun drawn, moving to the window with cat-like stealth. "Stay back," he murmured, peering through the glass. Florence's heart began to race again. "Is it them? Have they followed us?" Isaac's posture relaxed slightly. "No, it's Seth Miller, one of the homesteaders, but a friend." He moved to the door, opening it as a wiry man on a dappled mare approached the cabin. "Garrison," the man called, raising a hand in greeting, "thought I might find you up here." His eyes landed on Florence through the open door, and his expression shifted to surprise. "Oh, didn't know you had company." "Seth," Isaac nodded. "This is Miss Florence Reynolds, Gilbert's niece from back east. Miss Reynolds, Seth Miller farms about 3 miles east of here." Florence rose, nodding politely as the man removed his hat. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with honest brown eyes and a sunburned face. "Miss Reynolds, pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Seth turned back to Isaac. "Which is why I'm here. Thought you should know things have gone bad in town, real bad." Isaac's expression hardened. "How bad?" "Holcomb's foreman Jenkins got shot, not dead but close to it. Holcomb's blaming the association, saying we tried to assassinate him." Seth twisted his hat in his hands. "Marshall's trying to keep the peace, but Holcomb's riders are out for blood. They've already burned the Wilsons' place to the ground." Florence gasped. "That's terrible. Were the Wilsons hurt?" Seth shook his head. "They weren't home, thank the Lord." "But Holcomb's making it clear he means to drive every last homesteader out of the valley." "And the association?" Isaac asked quietly, talking about forming a militia. "Davis and Patterson are already rounding up men." Seth's eyes were troubled. "There's talk of going after the Blackwater Ranch tonight." Isaac cursed under his breath. "Fools, the lot of them." "That's why I came to you," Seth said earnestly. "You've got respect on both sides." "If anyone could talk sense into them, I've tried talking sense for 2 years." Isaac cut him off. "Neither side is listening anymore." "But they'll kill each other," Florence interjected, unable to remain silent. "Surely something can be done." Both men looked at her, and Florence felt a flush rising to her cheeks at her outburst, but she didn't back down. "Miss Reynolds is right," Seth said finally. "This isn't just pushing and shoving anymore. People are going to die." Isaac paced to the window and back, conflict evident in every line of his body. Finally, he stopped, shoulders set with resolve. "All right, I'll try talking to them, but first I need to get Miss Reynolds somewhere safe." He turned to Florence. "The mission at San Xavier is about 10 miles south. The sisters there will give you shelter until this blows over." "No," Florence said firmly, rising to her feet. "I'm going back to town." Isaac's eyes narrowed. "That's not safe." "Neither is anywhere in this valley from the sound of it," Florence countered. "But that store is all I have now." "I won't abandon it, Miss Reynolds," Seth interjected gently. "Your uncle's store, I'm afraid it was damaged in the fighting." "Nothing that can't be repaired," he added hastily, seeing her face pale. "But it might not be habitable right now." Florence sank back into her chair. "All the more reason I need to return, to assess the damage, to begin repairs." Isaac and Seth exchanged a look that Florence couldn't quite interpret. Finally, Isaac sighed. "You're determined to go back no matter what I say, aren't you?" Florence met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "Then I'll take you," Isaac said, his tone making it clear the decision was final. But you'll stay with Mrs. Abernathy at the boarding house, not at the store, and you'll promise to keep your head down until this is resolved." "Mrs. Abernathy's is a good idea," Seth agreed. "She's respected by both sides. No one would dare cause trouble there." Florence wanted to argue further. She was a grown woman, perfectly capable of making her own decisions, but she recognized the practicality of their suggestion. "Very well, Mrs. Abernathy's it is. When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow," Isaac decided. Too risky to travel after dark with trigger-happy men on both sides patrolling the roads. He turned to Seth. "You're welcome to stay the night as well. It's a long ride back to your place." Seth nodded gratefully. "Much obliged." "I brought some provisions, figuring you might be running low." He patted a saddlebag. "Even managed to save a bit of my wife's apple pie." As the men settled in to discuss the situation further, Florence found herself staring into the flames of the small fire, trying to process everything that had happened. Just yesterday, she had been unpacking her trunks in the rooms above her uncle's store, full of hope for her new beginning. Now she was sheltering in a cabin in the hills with two strange men, while the town below teetered on the brink of all-out war. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how would she find her place in this dangerous new world? The evening passed in a blur of simple meals and tense conversation. Seth and Isaac spoke of people and places Florence didn't know, of grievances that stretched back years, of broken promises and escalating threats. She listened intently, piecing together the complex tapestry of alliances and enmities that defined life in Silvercreek. Theodore Holcomb had come to the territory in the 1850s, when it was still largely unsettled by white men. He had built Blackwater Ranch from nothing, fighting Apaches and the harsh desert to establish his cattle empire. By the time Arizona became a territory in 1863, Holcomb controlled most of the water rights in the valley, but the Homestead Act brought changes. Families looking for a fresh start began to arrive, staking claims to land that Holcomb had always used for grazing, though he held no legal title to much of it. As more settlers arrived, forming the Valley Settlers Association, tensions grew. Fences were cut, cattle stampeded through crops, water sources mysteriously dried up or were diverted. "And where do you fit in all this, Mr. Garrison?" Florence asked during a lull in the conversation. Isaac's expression grew guarded. "I worked for Holcomb once, a long time ago." "But not anymore," Florence prompted when he didn't continue. "No," his voice was flat. "Not anymore." Seth cleared his throat awkwardly. "Isaac here saved half the association's farms last summer during the drought, found a new water source when Holcomb dammed the creek." Isaac looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just showed them where to dig. The water was already there. Without it, we'd have lost everything," Seth insisted. "That's why folks listen to you, Garrison. You've helped both sides at different times." "Fat lot of good it's done," Isaac muttered, rising to check outside again, a habit Florence had noticed throughout the evening. As night fell fully, sleeping arrangements became the next challenge. Isaac insisted Florence take the bed while he and Seth would sleep on bedrolls near the fire. Despite her protests that she could manage with a bedroll as well, Isaac was adamant. "My mother would haunt me from the grave if I let a lady sleep on the floor while I took the bed," he said with finality. Too exhausted to argue further, Florence accepted, though she felt strange climbing into a man's bed while he was present. Isaac discreetly turned his back as she removed only her outer layers, keeping her chemise and petticoat on as she slipped beneath the rough blankets. They smelled of pine and something uniquely Isaac, that clean, outdoor scent she had noticed earlier. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. The day's events kept replaying in her mind, along with worries about what awaited her in town. Would her store still be standing? Had all her careful planning and the last of her savings been wasted on this wild venture? Through half-closed eyes, she watched Isaac and Seth talking quietly by the fire, their voices too low to make out the words. There was something reassuring about Isaac's presence. She realized a steadiness that made her feel safer despite the chaos surrounding them. Eventually, the men settled onto their bedrolls, and the cabin grew quiet except for the occasional pop from the dying fire. Florence drifted off to sleep with the strange realization that despite everything, she felt more alive than she had in years. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, the gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's small windows. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the previous day's events came rushing back and she sat up quickly. Isaac stood at the small cast-iron stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. Seth was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning," Isaac said without turning. "Hope you slept well." Florence smoothed her hair self-consciously, aware of how disheveled she must look. "Yes, thank you. Where's Mr. Miller?" Left before first light. Wanted to check on his farm before heading to the association meeting. Isaac finally turned, offering her a steaming cup. "Coffee, thank you." She accepted the cup, careful not to let their fingers touch. In the soft morning light, she noticed details about him she had missed yesterday: a thin scar that ran along his jawline, the slight flecks of gray at his temples despite him not looking much past 30. "We should eat and get moving," Isaac said, turning back to the stove. "I want to reach town before the day heats up." Florence slipped from the bed, grateful that she'd kept most of her clothes on. "May I? Is there somewhere I might freshen up?" Isaac pointed to a basin of water he'd prepared on a small stand. "It's not much, but it's clean." "There's a bit of soap there too. Thank you." Florence waited until he stepped outside, presumably to give her privacy, before quickly washing her face and hands and doing what she could to tidy her hair. Her reflection in the small mirror above the basin showed a woman she hardly recognized, her usually neat appearance rumpled, a smudge of dirt still on her cheek, her eyes holding a new wariness. By the time Isaac returned, she had managed to make herself somewhat presentable and was seated at the table. He served a simple but hearty breakfast of bacon, biscuits, and more of his surprisingly good coffee. "You're quite the cook, Mr. Garrison," Florence remarked, genuinely impressed. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Man living alone either learns to cook or starves. I chose the former, a wise decision." Florence took another bite of the perfectly cooked biscuit. "Did you learn from your mother?" Something shuddered in Isaac's expression. "No. My mother died when I was young, picked it up here and there, mostly trail cooking with cattle drives." "I'm sorry about your mother," Florence said softly. Isaac merely nodded, focusing on his own plate. After a moment, he spoke again. "When we get to town, things might still be unsettled. Stay close to me, and if there's trouble, do exactly as I say. No arguments." Florence wanted to bristle at his commanding tone, but recognized the genuine concern behind it. "I understand. I'll take you straight to Mrs. Abernathy's. Then I need to talk to both Holcomb and the association leaders, see if I can knock some sense into them." "Do you really think you can stop them from fighting?" Florence asked. Isaac's expression was grim. "Probably not, but I have to try." They finished breakfast in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they cleaned up, working together with surprising ease, Florence found herself stealing glances at this enigmatic man who had risked his life for a stranger and now seemed determined to prevent a range war single-handedly. The ride back to town was tense, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of trouble. Isaac kept them to less traveled paths, occasionally stopping to listen or study the horizon. Florence, again seated behind him on copper, found herself growing accustomed to the rhythm of the horse and the solid presence of Isaac before her. As they crested a ridge that offered a view of Silvercreek below, both drew in sharp breaths. Even from a distance, the damage was visible. Several buildings showed fire damage, and what appeared to be barricades had been erected at either end of Main Street. "It's worse than I thought," Isaac muttered. Florence's eyes sought out her uncle's store, relief washing through her when she saw it still standing, though one window appeared to be broken. "At least the store is intact. For now," Isaac said grimly, urging Copper forward. "Let's hope it stays that way." They approached town cautiously, Isaac eventually dismounting and leading Copper by the reins as they neared the outskirts. The streets were eerily quiet for mid-morning, with few people visible. "Where is everyone?" Florence whispered, walking beside Isaac now, inside, waiting. His hand rested on his gun, eyes constantly moving. No one wants to be caught in the open if shooting starts again. They turned onto a side street, avoiding Main Street entirely. Isaac led them to a tidy 2-story house with a small sign identifying it as Abernathy Boarding House. Before they could reach the door, it opened, revealing a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. "Isaac Garrison," the woman said, hands on her hips. "I might have known you'd turn up in the middle of all this." "Mrs. Abernathy," Isaac nodded respectfully. "This is Miss Florence Reynolds, Gilbert's niece. She needs a safe place to stay while this mess gets sorted out." Mrs. Abernathy's stern expression softened as she turned to Florence. "Of course, dear. I knew your uncle well, a good man. Come in, come in." "You look like you've been through the ringer." Florence felt an immediate liking for the straightforward woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. I'm very grateful." As they stepped inside, Florence became aware of several pairs of eyes watching them from the parlor, other boarders, she assumed, seeking refuge from the town's troubles. "Isaac," Mrs. Abernathy said quietly, "Marshal Thornton's been looking for you. Says you might be the only one who can talk sense into both sides." Isaac's jaw tightened. "That's my next stop." "Be careful," the older woman cautioned. "Holcomb's in a rage about Jenkins, and Davis is no better. They're both spoiling for a fight." "I know." Isaac turned to Florence. "Stay here. Don't go to your store or anywhere else until I come back for you." Florence wanted to object. She was a grown woman, not a child to be ordered about, but something in his eyes stopped her. Concern, yes, but also a weariness that suggested he had seen the worst that men could do to each other. "I'll stay," she promised. "But please be careful, Mr. Garrison." His expression softened slightly. "Isaac, after everything, I think you can call me Isaac." "Isaac," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This will end one way or another, then you can start that new beginning you came for." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Mrs. Abernathy placed a gentle hand on Florence's shoulder. "Come, dear, let's get you settled. You look like you could use a proper bath and a change of clothes." Florence allowed herself to be led upstairs, her mind still on the man who had just walked out the door and into danger for her sake, and for a town that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The next hours passed in a blur of hot water, clean clothes borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy's daughter, and the comfort of a proper woman's bedroom after her night in Isaac's cabin. The boarding house was a hive of nervous energy, with residents gathering in the parlor to exchange rumors and speculation about what was happening outside. By mid-afternoon, Florence could stand it no longer. She made her way downstairs, finding Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen preparing what appeared to be enough food for an army. "Is there news?" Florence asked, rolling up her sleeves to help without being asked. Mrs. Abernathy sighed, handing her a bowl of potatoes to peel. "Some. Marshall's called a town meeting at the church. Neutral ground, he says. Both Holcomb and the association leaders have agreed to attend." "That sounds promising," Florence ventured. "Maybe." The older woman didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe they're just getting everyone in one place to make it easier to kill each other." Florence's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. "Surely it won't come to that. I've lived in this territory for 30 years, Miss Reynolds. I've seen what men will do when they believe their livelihoods are threatened." Mrs. Abernathy's knife moved with practiced efficiency through a pile of carrots. "But if anyone can prevent bloodshed, it's Isaac Garrison." "You seem to have a high opinion of him," Florence observed, trying to keep her tone casual. Mrs. Abernathy's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Isaac's a good man who's seen bad times. He came to Silvercreek 5 years ago to work for Holcomb, rose to foreman faster than anyone expected. But when the settlers started arriving and Holcomb ordered some unsavory tactics to drive them off, Isaac refused. He left Blackwater Ranch," Florence prompted when the woman paused, "left with nothing but his horse and his gun after nearly coming to blows with Holcomb himself." Mrs. Abernathy shook her head at the memory. He's been on his own ever since, taking odd jobs, helping where he can. Both sides respect him, even if neither fully trusts him. Florence absorbed this information, the picture of Isaac becoming clearer in her mind. A man of principle who had given up security for what he believed was right. The meetings at sundown, Mrs. Abernathy continued. I'm preparing food because one way or another people will need feeding afterward. She gave Florence a significant look. And I expect you'll want to attend despite what Isaac told you, Florence flushed. That is, girl, I've raised 4 daughters. I know that look of stubborn determination when I see it. Mrs. Abernathy's stern expression gave way to a small smile. Just stay at the back and keep your head down. The church will be packed. One more person won't be noticed. Relief washed over Florence. Thank you for understanding. Understanding doesn't mean approving, the older woman warned. But I suspect you and Isaac Garrison are well matched in the stubborn department. Florence focused intently on her potato peeling, hoping Mrs. Abernathy wouldn't notice the blush that crept up her cheeks at the implied connection between herself and Isaac. She hardly knew the man, after all. And yet, in the short time since he'd pulled her behind that wagon, something had shifted in her world, something she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, tension in the boarding house rose palpably. Residents prepared to attend the meeting, speaking in hushed tones about what might happen. Florence borrowed a shawl from Mrs. Abernathy and slipped out with a group of other boarders, trying to appear inconspicuous. The church stood at the north end of town, a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Even from a distance, Florence could see people converging on it from all directions: townspeople, ranchers in their distinctive clothing, homesteaders in more practical work clothes. Many were armed, despite Marshal Thornton standing at the door, apparently requesting that weapons be left outside. Florence managed to enter without drawing attention, finding a spot at the very back where she could observe without being easily seen. The interior was already crowded, the wooden pews filled beyond capacity, forcing many to stand along the walls. The air was thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. At the front, near the pulpit, stood a group of men engaged in what appeared to be tense conversation. Florence recognized Isaac immediately, his tall frame and broad shoulders distinctive even from behind. Beside him was a silver-haired man with a star pinned to his vest. Marshal Thornton, she presumed. Facing them stood 2 very different men. One was corpulent and red-faced, dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as a man of wealth, Theodore Holcomb, without a doubt. The other was lean and weathered, with calloused hands and suspenders over a work shirt, likely Samuel Davis, whom she had heard mentioned as the association's leader. The conversation at the front grew heated, Holcomb's voice rising above the general murmur of the crowd. I will not negotiate with thieves and murderers. Jenkins is fighting for his life because of these vermin. We had nothing to do with Jenkins getting shot, Davis retorted. But we've buried 3 of our own this past year, Holcomb, or have you forgotten the Peterson's boy? The crowd grew louder, partisan shouts coming from both sides of the church, which had naturally segregated itself, ranchers on one side, settlers on the other. Florence felt fear rising in her throat as the shouting increased, hands moving ominously toward gun belts despite the marshal's prohibition. Then Isaac stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din with surprising authority. Enough. The single word delivered with such force silenced the church momentarily. All eyes turned to Isaac, who now stood between the 2 faction leaders, his stance wide and unyielding. Look at yourselves, he continued, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the building. Ready to slaughter each other in a house of God. For what? Land that was here before any of us and will be here long after we're gone. Easy for you to say, Garrison, Holcomb sneered. You've got no stake in this fight. No stake, Isaac's laugh held no humor. I've buried friends from both sides of this pointless feud. I've watched good men become killers over water rights and grazing land. Everyone in this valley has a stake in what happens next. He turned slowly, addressing the entire church now. You all know me. I've worked with most of you at one time or another. I've broken bread at your tables, helped birth your cattle, dug wells for your farms. He paused, letting his words sink in. And I'm telling you now, this ends today or we all lose everything. Florence found herself holding her breath, captivated by the quiet power in his voice, the conviction that seemed to radiate from him. The territory's changing, Isaac continued. More people coming every day, the old ways, he glanced at Holcomb, they can't hold. But that doesn't mean the newcomers can just take whatever they want. This time his gaze fell on Davis. There's room for everyone if we're smart enough to find a way to share. Holcomb's face flushed darker. My father fought Apaches for that land, my men died defending it. And now I should just share it with any drifter who plants a fence post. And my children are supposed to go thirsty because your cattle need the whole creek, Davis countered. The law says we have a right to be here, Holcomb. The murmuring started again, tensions rising. Florence saw Isaac's shoulders tense as he realized he was losing them. Then, without fully understanding why, Florence found herself moving forward, pushing through the crowd toward the front of the church. Something in Isaac's words and his desperate attempt to forge peace had kindled a fire in her. She had come west for a new beginning, perhaps this was it, though not in the way she had imagined. Wait, she called, her voice cutting through the rising noise. Please listen. All eyes turned to her, surprise evident on most faces. Isaac's expression shifted from shock to something like alarm as he spotted her. Miss Reynolds, Marshal Thornton began. This isn't, I know I'm new here, Florence interrupted, her heart pounding but her voice steady. I've been in Silvercreek less than a week, but sometimes an outsider can see things more clearly. She moved to stand beside Isaac, drawing strength from his presence. My uncle's store served everyone in this valley, ranchers, farmers, townspeople. He understood something you've all forgotten: you need each other. With all due respect, miss, Holcomb said, his tone suggesting no respect at all, you know nothing about our situation. I know that if you keep fighting, there won't be a Silvercreek left for anyone, Florence replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Mr. Holcomb, your cattle need places to graze and water, yes, but they also need markets for your beef and supplies that come through town. And you, Mr. Davis, your farms need protection from the elements and predators. You need the stability that established ranches provide. She looked around the church, meeting as many eyes as she could. Back east, I watched communities tear themselves apart during the war. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, no one won. Everyone lost something precious. A hush had fallen over the crowd, all eyes fixed on this unexpected speaker. My uncle's store sits right in the middle of town, neutral ground, as Mr. Garrison called it. What if we used it as a place to start? A place where both sides could meet, discuss grievances, find solutions. Florence turned to Isaac, seeking confirmation. Isn't that better than bloodshed? Isaac was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read: surprise, certainly, but also something warmer, almost like pride. The lady has a point, Marshal Thornton said into the silence that followed. We've tried fighting. It's gotten us nowhere except more graves on Boot Hill. Holcomb scoffed, but Florence noticed he seemed less certain than before. Pretty words won't change the fact that there's not enough water for everyone if these homesteaders keep diverting the creeks. Actually, Isaac interjected, that's not entirely true. He glanced at Florence, a silent communication passing between them before he continued. I've been mapping the underground springs in this area for years. There's more water than anyone realizes, it's just a matter of accessing it properly. This revelation caused a stir among both factions. Davis stepped forward, eyes narrowed. You mean wells? We've tried digging wells, but they're too deep for most of us to manage alone. Because you're digging in the wrong places, Isaac explained. But if people worked together, shared labor, shared equipment, it could work. Florence watched as the idea took root, saw the calculating looks being exchanged. Self-interest was a powerful motivator, and if both sides could see a path to prosperity that didn't require eliminating the other. I propose a truce, she said firmly. 2 weeks. No fighting, no sabotage, no accusations, just talking and planning, using my store as neutral ground. She looked directly at Holcomb and Davis. What do you have to lose by trying? The two leaders stared at each other across the church, decades of distrust and animosity between them. For a moment, Florence thought they would refuse. That violence was too deeply ingrained to be set aside even temporarily. Then, to her astonishment, Marshal Thornton stepped forward and extended his hand to Holcomb. As a representative of territorial law, I endorse Miss Reynolds' proposal. Mr. Holcomb, what say you? After what seemed an eternity, Holcomb grudgingly took the marshal's hand. 2 weeks, but if one more of my men is harmed, all bets are off. Davis stepped forward next, shaking the marshal's hand firmly. The association agrees. 2 weeks of honest negotiation. A collective exhalation seemed to pass through the church, the tension dissipating like morning mist under the sun. Not gone entirely, but lessened enough that people began to breathe more easily, to look at their neighbors with something other than suspicion. Florence felt a light touch at her elbow and turned to find Isaac beside her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted, suddenly aware of how forward she had been. Ladies in Boston society did not address crowds of armed men or insert themselves into territorial disputes, but Isaac's eyes held no censure, only a warm approval that made her heart beat faster. "You might have just prevented a bloodbath." "We prevented it," she corrected him. "Your words laid the foundation, I merely built upon them." Around them, the church was emptying, people filing out in smaller, more subdued groups than they had entered. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at Florence's side, her expression a mixture of exasperation and pride. "So much for keeping your head down," the older woman said, though there was no real reproach in her tone. "Come along, both of you. I've got enough stew for an army, and after that performance, you must be famished." Florence realized she was indeed hungry, ravenous, in fact. The intensity of the meeting had consumed all her attention, leaving no room for awareness of physical needs. As they followed Mrs. Abernathy out of the church, Florence was acutely conscious of Isaac walking beside her, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. The contact, though fleeting, sent small shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, a beautiful end to a day that had begun in such uncertainty. People lingered in small groups, talking quietly, the usual division between ranchers and settlers less rigid than before. "It won't be easy," Isaac said, noticing the direction of her gaze. 2 weeks won't erase years of bad blood." "No," Florence agreed, "but it's a start, and sometimes that's all people need, a chance to begin again." His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "A new beginning." "Yes," she said softly, holding his gaze. "Exactly that." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither had voiced. Then Mrs. Abernathy called from ahead, breaking the spell. "If you two don't hurry, the stew will be cold and the biscuits hard as rocks." Isaac offered his arm with a small smile. "Shall we, Miss Reynolds? I've learned it's unwise to keep Mrs. Abernathy waiting, especially where food is concerned." Florence placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the solid strength beneath his shirt sleeve. "I believe you're right, Mr. Garrison. And after today, I find I'm in no mood to court further danger." His laugh was unexpected and wonderful, a deep, genuine sound that transformed his serious face and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Somehow I doubt that very much, Florence Reynolds. Somehow I doubt that very much indeed." The days that followed took on a rhythm that Florence would never have imagined when she first arrived in Silvercreek. Mornings were spent overseeing repairs to her uncle's store, which had suffered broken windows and some bullet damage, but was otherwise intact. Local men from both factions, perhaps eager to demonstrate their commitment to the truce, volunteered to help with the work. Afternoons saw the store transformed into the promised neutral meeting ground. Florence cleared the back storeroom, setting up a large table where Holcomb, Davis, and other stakeholders could gather to discuss water rights, grazing boundaries, and other contentious issues. Marshal Thornton usually presided, with Isaac often present as a technical advisor regarding water sources and land usage. The negotiations were tense, progress maddeningly slow. More than once, Florence had to step in with coffee and her aunt's prized spice cake to break the tension when tempers flared. Her presence seemed to have a moderating effect on the men, whether out of respect for a lady or simply the novelty of a female perspective in such discussions. She wasn't sure. Isaac was a constant presence during this time, though his role remained difficult to define. He was not exactly a friend, yet more than an acquaintance. He took meals at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house where Florence still stayed, often lingering afterward for conversation. He escorted her to and from the store each day, ostensibly for protection, though the town had remained peaceful since the church meeting. On the 5th day of negotiations, Florence found herself alone in the store with Isaac after a particularly difficult session that had ended with Holcomb storming out, promising to return the next day with reasonable demands or none at all. "You think this is working?" she asked, straightening chairs that had been pushed back in haste. "Sometimes it feels like we're going in circles." Isaac considered the question as he helped her gather empty coffee cups. "They're still talking, that's something." He set the cups on a tray, "and Jenkins is recovering." "That's taken some of the fire out of Holcomb's position." Florence sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The neat bun she started each day with inevitably loosened as the hours passed, a fact she had become less concerned with as days went by. Silvercreek had different standards than Boston, she was learning. "I just wish there was more progress. The 2-week truce is almost half over." Isaac leaned against the counter, studying her with those clear green eyes that seemed to see more than she sometimes wished to reveal. "You've accomplished more in 5 days than anyone has in years. Give it time." "Time is precisely what we may not have," Florence reminded him, moving to the window to gaze out at the town. The street outside was busier than when she'd first arrived, people moving about their business with less wariness. "If we can't show real results by the end of the truce." She let the thought hang unfinished. They both knew what could happen. Florence. Isaac's voice was closer now, and she turned to find him standing just behind her. "Whatever happens, you've changed things here, shown people another way forward." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "We've changed things," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." His eyes searched hers, and Florence felt her breath catch at the intensity she found there. For a moment, she thought he might step closer, might bridge the small distance between them that seemed to grow more charged with each passing day. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back. "It's getting late. I should see you back to Mrs. Abernathy's." The moment broken, Florence nodded, trying not to feel disappointed. "Of course, just let me get my shawl." As they walked the short distance to the boarding house, Florence was acutely aware of Isaac beside her, of his measured stride matching hers, of the occasional brush of his arm against her shoulder. Something was building between them, something neither seemed ready to acknowledge directly. "Will you be at tomorrow's meeting?" she asked as they reached Mrs. Abernathy's gate. "Yes." Isaac hesitated, then added, "But I'll be late. I need to ride out to Willow Creek first, check the flow after yesterday's rain. It might give us some leverage with Holcomb if it's running stronger." "I see." Florence tried not to show her disappointment at the prospect of facing the morning's negotiations without his steady presence. "Be careful. The truce doesn't necessarily extend to isolated creek beds." The corner of his mouth lifted in that half-smile she was coming to know well. "I'm always careful, Miss Reynolds. Except when diving behind wagons to rescue strange women during gunfights," she reminded him, her own lips curving upward, his expression softened, eyes warming as they held hers. "Well, there are some risks worth taking." The air between them seemed to still, the sounds of the town fading as they stood facing each other at the gate. Florence felt a pull toward him, an almost physical urge to step closer, to discover if his lips would be as warm as they looked. The boarding house door opened, spilling light and voices into the gathering dusk, breaking the moment once again. "Until tomorrow, then," Florence said quickly, suddenly self-conscious. Isaac nodded, stepping back. "Tomorrow." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunset before turning to enter the boarding house. Mrs. Abernathy met her in the hallway, a knowing look in her shrewd eyes. "That man is sweet on you, girl," the older woman said without preamble. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Garrison is merely being helpful during a difficult situation. MMHMM. Mrs. Abernathy's skeptical hum spoke volumes. "And I suppose that's why he watches you when you're not looking, like a man who's found water after days in the desert." "Mrs. Abernathy," Florence protested, though her heart gave a small leap at the older woman's words, "just calling it as I see it." Mrs. Abernathy patted her arm, "And for what it's worth, you look at him the same way when his back is turned." Before Florence could form a coherent denial, the older woman had moved on toward the kitchen, leaving her standing in the hallway with her thoughts in disarray and her cheeks burning. Was it true? Had she developed feelings for Isaac Garrison in the span of less than a week? It seemed impossible, and yet she found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning, missed his presence when he was absent, felt a warmth spread through her whenever their eyes met. In Boston, courtships were formal, measured things, proceeding according to strict social rules. But here in Silvercreek, with danger and uncertainty pressing in from all sides, perhaps it was natural for connections to form more quickly, more deeply. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She had come west for independence, for the chance to build something that was entirely her own. Romantic entanglements had not featured in her careful plans. But then, very little about Silvercreek had matched her expectations. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the air holding the first hint of autumn despite the summer heat that would build as the day progressed. Florence dressed with particular care in her blue calico dress, the same one she had worn on that fateful first day, now mended and cleaned before heading to the store to prepare for the day's negotiations. The street was quiet as she walked alone, having assured Mrs. Abernathy that she would be fine for the short distance in broad daylight. The truce seemed to be holding, and people were beginning to relax into routines that had been disrupted by the recent violence. As she rounded the corner onto Main Street, Florence stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. In front of her store stood Theodore Holcomb and two of his men, their horses tied to the hitching post outside. They appeared to be waiting, and from their expressions, not patiently. Gathering her courage, Florence approached, her chin held high. "Mr. Holcomb, you're early for the meeting." Holcomb turned, his florid face unreadable. "Miss Reynolds, I was hoping to speak with you privately before the others arrive." Florence felt a flutter of unease but maintained her composed exterior. "Of course, please come inside." She unlocked the store, moving with deliberate calm as she lit lamps and set her belongings aside. Holcomb followed, leaving his men outside, for which she was grateful. "Coffee?" she offered, falling back on social niceties to mask her nervousness. "No, thank you." Holcomb removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. Without the blustering anger she had seen at the church meeting, he looked older, more weary. "I'll come straight to the point, Miss Reynolds." "I want to buy your store." Florence blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon, your store. I'm prepared to offer a generous sum, twice what it's worth, enough for you to return east in comfort or establish yourself elsewhere in the territory." Florence's mind raced, trying to understand the motivation behind this unexpected offer. "Mr. Holcomb, I have no intention of selling. This store is my livelihood, my future." "It could also be your grave," Holcomb said bluntly. "This truce is temporary, Miss Reynolds. When it ends, the fighting will resume. Your neutral ground will once again be caught in the crossfire." The threat, thinly veiled as concern, raised Florence's hackles. "Are you suggesting you would deliberately target my property, Mr. Holcomb?" "I'm suggesting that Silvercreek is no place for a woman alone," he replied, his tone softening to something almost paternal. "You've made a valiant effort, but surely you can see this situation is beyond your control." Florence straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. With respect, sir, I disagree. The negotiations have shown progress. There is room for compromise if both sides are willing. Holcomb's expression hardened. Compromise means weakness in this territory, Miss Reynolds. I didn't build Blackwater Ranch by compromising. Perhaps not, Florence acknowledged. But times change. As Mr. Garrison has pointed out, the old ways cannot hold forever. At the mention of Isaac's name, Holcomb's face darkened further. Garrison, I should have known he'd be filling your head with nonsense. Tell me, has he mentioned how he betrayed my trust? How he turned against the man who gave him a chance when no one else would? Florence kept her expression neutral. Mr. Garrison has been nothing but helpful during this difficult time. His knowledge of the valley has been invaluable to the negotiations. His knowledge, Holcomb scoffed. Did he tell you how he acquired that knowledge, riding my land for years, learning my operation from the inside, only to use it against me when it suited him? I understand you feel betrayed, Florence said carefully. But from what I've gathered, Mr. Garrison left your employment because he refused to participate in actions he found morally objectionable. Holcomb stepped closer, his voice dropping. Is that what he told you? That he took the moral high ground, he shook his head. Garrison was in love with my daughter, Miss Reynolds. Eleanor was young, impressionable. When I refused to bless the match, he turned against me. His principles had nothing to do with it. Florence felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Isaac and Holcomb's daughter, he had never mentioned any such connection. Was Holcomb telling the truth, or simply trying to drive a wedge between them? I fail to see what this has to do with your offer to buy my store, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Consider it context, Holcomb replied, settling his hat back on his head. Garrison isn't the white knight you seem to think he is, and these negotiations you've pinned your hopes on. They're doomed to fail because the fundamental problem remains. There isn't enough water or good grazing land for both Blackwater and the homesteaders. Mr. Garrison believes there is, Florence countered, clinging to what she knew to be true. The underground springs, myths, and wishful thinking, Holcomb cut her off. I've had surveyors from Sacramento examine every inch of this valley. If there was more water to be had, don't you think I'd be the first to develop it? Doubt crept into Florence's mind, unwelcome but persistent. What if Isaac was wrong? What if the compromise she'd staked everything on was impossible? My offer stands until the end of the week, Holcomb said, moving toward the door. After that, I cannot guarantee your safety or the future of this establishment. Think carefully, Miss Reynolds. You've made a brave attempt, but sometimes wisdom lies in knowing when to retreat. With that, he departed, leaving Florence alone with her thoughts whirling like autumn leaves in a storm. She sank into a chair, trying to sort through her conflicting emotions. Was Holcomb telling the truth about Isaac and his daughter? And if so, why hadn't Isaac mentioned it? It would certainly explain the personal animosity between the two men, which seemed to go beyond professional disagreement. And what of the water sources Isaac had spoken of with such confidence? Was he mistaken, or deliberately offering false hope? Florence was still wrestling with these questions when the bell above the door jangled, announcing the arrival of Samuel Davis and 2 other association members for the morning's negotiations. She rose quickly, plastering on a composed smile while pushing her doubts to the back of her mind. There would be time to confront Isaac with Holcomb's claims later. The meeting proceeded with the usual mix of progress and setbacks. Holcomb returned with his ranch foreman, his manner giving no indication of their earlier private conversation. Marshal Thornton moderated as best he could, but by mid-morning, it was clear that, without Isaac's technical knowledge to guide the discussion of water resources, they were talking in circles. "Where's Garrison anyway?" Holcomb demanded during a particularly heated exchange. "Convenient that he's absent just when we need specifics about these supposed underground springs." "Mr. Garrison is surveying Willow Creek," Florence replied, maintaining her composure despite her own lingering questions. "He should return by afternoon." Davis leaned forward, addressing Holcomb directly. "The point is, if Garrison's right about the water table, we could all have what we need. Your cattle get the existing creek access, our farms get wells. Everyone wins, if, Holcomb emphasized. That's a mighty big if to stake the future of this valley on. The debate continued, growing more heated as the morning wore on. Florence served more coffee, mediated where she could, but found her attention repeatedly drawn to the window, watching for Isaac's return. By noon, with tempers fraying and no resolution in sight, Marshal Thornton called for a break. Let's reconvene at 2. Hopefully Garrison will be back by then with the information we need. As the participants filed out, Florence busied herself cleaning up, her mind still troubled by Holcomb's revelations and Isaac's continued absence. He had said he would be late, but she hadn't expected him to miss the entire morning session. She was just putting away the last of the coffee cups when the bell above the door jangled again. Turning, expecting to see Isaac at last, she instead found herself facing Seth Miller, his expression grave. "Miss Reynolds," he said, removing his hat, "I need to speak with you. It's about Isaac." Florence's heart seemed to stutter in her chest. "What's happened? Is he hurt?" "Not hurt, no." Seth twisted his hat in his hands. "But there's trouble. Holcomb's men caught him on Blackwater land this morning. They're holding him at the ranch house, claiming he was trespassing with intent to sabotage." "That's absurd," Florence exclaimed. "Isaac was surveying Willow Creek, which runs through Blackwater property," Seth finished for her. "Holcomb's using it as an excuse to detain him. Word is he's threatening to have Isaac arrested, maybe even sent to the territorial prison in Yuma." Florence's mind raced. This explained Holcomb's early morning visit, his attempt to buy her out. He had already planned to remove Isaac from the equation, eliminating the technical expertise that gave the association's claims legitimacy. "Does Marshal Thornton know?" she asked, already reaching for her shawl. Seth nodded. "He's riding out there now, but his authority only goes so far when it comes to Holcomb. The old man has friends in the territorial government." Florence moved toward the door with determination. "Take me there." "To Blackwater Ranch." Seth looked alarmed. "Miss Reynolds, that's not safe." "Holcomb's men, Holcomb won't harm a woman," Florence said with more confidence than she felt. "And I may have leverage he doesn't expect." Seth still looked doubtful, but something in her expression must have convinced him of her resolve. "My wagon's outside, but I still think this is a bad idea." The ride to Blackwater Ranch took nearly an hour, across rolling grasslands that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Florence used the time to think, to plan what she would say to Holcomb. Seth remained silent beside her, respecting her concentration. As they approached the ranch, Florence was struck by its size and grandeur. The main house was 2 stories of solid construction, with a wide veranda and imposing columns. Outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses spread in all directions, evidence of Holcomb's power and wealth. Several men watched their approach, hands resting meaningfully on holstered guns. Seth pulled the wagon to a stop in the main yard, his posture tense. "Miss Reynolds," he murmured, "let me do the talking at first." Florence nodded, scanning the buildings for any sign of Isaac or Marshal Thornton. Before Seth could speak, however, the front door of the main house opened, and Theodore Holcomb himself emerged, followed by a younger man Florence didn't recognize. "Miller," Holcomb acknowledged coldly, "you're trespassing." "Mr. Holcomb," Florence interjected, rising from her seat on the wagon, "I've come to speak with you about Mr. Garrison." Holcomb's eyebrows rose as he took in her presence. "Miss Reynolds, this is unexpected and unwise." Florence climbed down from the wagon despite Seth's attempt to stop her. "Nevertheless, I'm here. I understand you're holding Mr. Garrison on charges of trespassing." "Not just trespassing," the younger man beside Holcomb said, "sabotage. We caught him measuring water flow at points along Willow Creek, the same creek that was mysteriously dammed last month, cutting off water to our south pasture." Florence studied the young man, noting his resemblance to Holcomb, the same heavy brow and square jaw, though without the older man's paunch and florid complexion. Holcomb's son, most likely. Mr. Garrison was conducting survey work related to the ongoing negotiations, Florence explained calmly. Work that both parties agreed was necessary. Agreed to survey public land, Holcomb corrected, not private Blackwater property. Florence maintained her composure with effort. Where is Mr. Garrison now and Marshal Thornton? I understand he rode out here earlier. A flash of annoyance crossed Holcomb's face. The Marshal is speaking with Garrison in my study, a courtesy I extended out of respect for his office, though I was under no obligation to do so. Then I would like to join them, Florence said firmly. Holcomb studied her for a long moment, calculation evident in his gaze. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Very well, but Miller stays with the wagon. Seth started to protest, but Florence gave him a reassuring glance. It's all right, Mr. Miller, I'll be fine. With visible reluctance, Seth settled back in the wagon seat while Florence followed Holcomb and his son toward the house. As they climbed the steps to the veranda, the front door opened again, revealing a young woman in a fashionable riding habit, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a small hat. "Father," she inquired, her curious gaze moving from Holcomb to Florence, "is everything all right?" "Eleanor," Holcomb acknowledged. "This is Miss Reynolds from town. She's here about the Garrison situation." Florence felt a jolt of recognition at the name. Eleanor Holcomb's daughter, the woman Isaac had supposedly loved. She was beautiful, Florence had to acknowledge, with delicate features and large blue eyes that widened at the mention of Isaac. "Mr. Garrison is here?" Eleanor asked, something like hope flashing across her face before she schooled her expression to neutral interest. "In the study with Marshal Thornton," Holcomb replied shortly. "Go back inside, Eleanor, this doesn't concern you." A flash of defiance crossed the young woman's features, but she complied, disappearing back into the house. Florence filed away this interaction for later consideration as she followed Holcomb through the imposing front door. The interior of the house was as grand as its exterior suggested: polished hardwood floors, expensive furnishings, paintings in gilt frames. Holcomb led her down a hallway to a closed door, which he opened without knocking. Inside, Marshal Thornton and Isaac stood on opposite sides of a large desk. Isaac's expression shifted from frustration to shock as Florence entered. "Florence, what are you doing here?" He moved toward her, only to be blocked by Holcomb's son. "Stay where you are, Garrison," the younger Holcomb warned. "It's all right, James," Holcomb said. "Let's hear what Miss Reynolds has to say that was important enough to bring her all this way." Florence met Isaac's concerned gaze briefly before turning to address Holcomb directly. "I've come to clarify the situation and, hopefully, resolve it without further escalation." Marshal Thornton stepped forward. "I've already explained to Mr. Holcomb that Mr. Garrison was acting within the scope of our agreement during the truce. His presence on Blackwater land, while technically trespassing, was in service to the negotiations both parties agreed to." "Negotiations I'm beginning to regret," Holcomb muttered, "especially when they involve my former employees sneaking around my water sources." "I wasn't sneaking," Isaac said firmly. "I was openly measuring flow rates, which anyone could see from 100 yards away. If I'd been planning sabotage, as James claims, I'd hardly have done it in broad daylight with surveying equipment." Florence could see the logic of this argument registering with Marshal Thornton, though Holcomb remained unmoved. "Mr. Holcomb," she began carefully, "this morning, before the meeting, you offered to buy my store for twice its value. You also warned me that the truce would not hold and implied that my property might be endangered when fighting resumed." Isaac's expression darkened, but Florence continued before he could speak. "Now I find that, while making this offer, you were already planning to detain Mr. Garrison, effectively undermining the negotiations by removing the one person with the technical knowledge to support a compromise solution." She met Holcomb's gaze directly. "One might interpret these actions as deliberately sabotaging the peace process." Marshal Thornton's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Is this true, Holcomb? Did you try to buy out Miss Reynolds while planning to arrest Garrison?" Holcomb's face flushed. "I made a legitimate business offer to a woman who is in over her head in a dangerous situation. As for Garrison, he was caught red-handed on my property. These events are unrelated. They seem remarkably coincidental," Florence observed. especially since removing both my store as neutral ground and Mr. Garrison as technical advisor would effectively end any chance of peaceful resolution. The tension in the room was palpable as Holcomb glared at Florence, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, especially by a woman. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Reynolds?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Florence straightened her spine, channeling all the strength she could muster. "I'm suggesting that your actions indicate you don't want these negotiations to succeed, that perhaps you're hoping for a resumption of hostilities, giving you an excuse to drive the homesteaders out once and for all." She paused, then added, "The territorial governor might take interest in such tactics, especially if violence results." The mention of the governor struck home. Holcomb's expression shifted, calculation replacing anger. "That's a serious accusation," Marshal Thornton said, though his tone suggested he found it plausible. "It's slander is what it is," James Holcomb interjected hotly. "This woman has no enough, James." Holcomb held up a hand, his gaze never leaving Florence. "Miss Reynolds clearly has more backbone than I gave her credit for." He moved to seat himself behind the desk, a power play that Florence recognized from her days working at the bank in Boston. "Let's discuss this rationally." For the next hour, they negotiated. Marshal Thornton served as a buffer, his official position lending weight to the proceedings. Isaac remained largely silent, though his eyes frequently sought Florence's, communicating a mix of concern and something warmer that made her pulse quicken despite the tense circumstances. In the end, they reached a compromise. Isaac would be released immediately, with all accusations of sabotage dropped. In return, future surveys of water sources on Blackwater land would be conducted with advance notice and in the presence of a Blackwater representative. The negotiations in town would continue as scheduled, with both Holcomb and the association committing to 2 more days of good faith discussions. As they prepared to leave, Holcomb held Florence back for a moment. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Reynolds," he said quietly. "Either way, I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again." Coming from Holcomb, it was almost a compliment. Florence inclined her head slightly. "I look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's meeting, Mr. Holcomb." Outside, Seth's relief at seeing them emerge unscathed was palpable. As they climbed into his wagon, Isaac close beside Florence on the seat, Seth gave a low whistle. "I didn't think you'd pull it off, Miss Reynolds, getting Garrison out of there without bloodshed." "Florence can be very persuasive when she puts her mind to it," Isaac said, his voice warm with admiration. As Seth urged the horses forward, Florence became acutely aware of Isaac beside her, their shoulders touching on the narrow wagon seat. She had come here to rescue him, driven by an impulse she hadn't fully examined. Now, with the immediate danger past, the questions Holcomb had raised earlier returned to her mind. "Seth," she said after they had cleared the main gates of Blackwater Ranch, "would you mind if Mr. Garrison and I walked back to town from here? I think we have some matters to discuss." Seth looked surprised but nodded. "If you're sure, it's a fair distance, though." "We'll be fine," Isaac assured him, already helping Florence down from the wagon. "The exercise will do us good after being cooped up in Holcomb's study." As Seth drove away, Florence and Isaac stood facing each other on the dusty road, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows around them. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them. "Thank you," Isaac said finally, "for coming after me. It was reckless and brave and possibly the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen anyone do." Florence couldn't help but smile at the echo of his words from the church meeting. "I seem to be making a habit of foolhardy bravery since coming to Silvercreek." They began walking, settling into a comfortable pace side by side. The road stretched before them, empty save for a distant rider heading toward town. "Isaac," Florence began after they had walked a while in companionable silence, "there's something I need to ask you." He glanced at her, his expression open but guarded. "I gathered as much when you suggested this walk." Florence took a deep breath. "This morning before the meeting, Mr. Holcomb came to see me. He offered to buy my store." "So I heard," Isaac said, his jaw tightening. "Convenient timing. Yes, but he also told me something else." Florence hesitated, then plunged ahead. "He said the reason you left Blackwater Ranch wasn't just about principles. He said it was because you were in love with his daughter, Alina, that he refused to bless the match, and that's why you turned against him." Isaac stopped walking, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and Florence's heart sank. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as frustration. "Holcomb never could tell a story straight," he said finally. "Yes, Alina and I were close. She was young, just 17 when I started working at Blackwater. Over the next 2 years, we developed feelings for each other." Florence tried to ignore the twinge of jealousy at this confirmation. "Did you love her?" Isaac met her gaze directly. "I thought I did at the time. She was beautiful, kind, sheltered from the harder aspects of frontier life. But what I felt for her wasn't why I left." They resumed walking, the pace slower now. Holcomb started pressuring homesteaders to leave cutting fences, stampeding cattle through crops, diverting water. When that didn't work, things got more violent. A homesteader named Peterson was found shot in the back while checking his fences. Isaac's voice hardened at the memory. "His son was with him. Boy was only 14. "That's terrible," Florence murmured. Holcomb denied any involvement, of course, but I knew his foreman, Jenkins, had been out in that area the day before making threats. Isaac kicked at a stone in the road. "I confronted Holcomb, told him I wouldn't be part of such tactics. He gave me a choice: fall in line or leave. I left. And Alina," Isaac's expression softened slightly. "She wanted to come with me, said she'd defy her father, marry me anyway, but she was still so young, so innocent. I couldn't ask her to leave everything she'd known for a life of uncertainty with me." He shook his head. "So I left alone." Florence absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with what she had seen at the ranch. "She still cares for you. I could see it in her face when your name was mentioned." A flicker of surprise crossed Isaac's features. "You met Alina?" "Briefly. She came out as we were arriving." Florence hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Do you still have feelings for her?" Isaac stopped again, turning to face Florence fully. The intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. "No," he said simply. "What I felt for Alina was real, but it was unfinished, a young man's infatuation that never had the chance to mature into something deeper." He took a step closer. "What I feel now for someone else is different." "Stronger." Florence's heart hammered against her ribs as Isaac reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "When I pulled you behind that wagon a week ago, I was just trying to keep an innocent bystander from getting shot," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I had no idea you'd turn out to be the bravest, most determined woman I've ever met. That you'd stand up to men twice your size, face down Holcomb in his own home, risk everything to create peace in a place that's known nothing but conflict for years." Florence could hardly breathe, captivated by the warmth in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. "I've spent 2 years standing apart, refusing to choose sides, telling myself I was remaining neutral on principle," Isaac continued. "But the truth is, I was hiding. Avoiding commitment, avoiding the risk of caring too much." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Then you walked into the middle of a gunfight and changed everything." "Isaac," Florence whispered, her voice unsteady, "I came west for independence. I wasn't looking for this." "Neither was I," he admitted with a small smile, "but here we are." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then, with deliberate slowness, Isaac raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The simple gesture sent a shiver of warmth through Florence, more affecting than any passionate embrace could have been. "We should keep walking," he said softly. "It's a long way back to town." Florence nodded, not trusting herself to speak as they resumed their journey, still hand in hand. The touch anchored her, a tangible connection to this man who had upended her carefully ordered plans and opened her heart to possibilities she hadn't dared consider. They walked in companionable silence for a time, each processing the shift in their relationship. The sun sank lower on the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues. "I've been thinking about the store," Florence said eventually. Isaac glanced at her. Oh, yes, it needs some changes. Expansion for one thing. The back room is too small for proper negotiations. She smiled up at him. And the living quarters upstairs could use improvement if they're to house more than one person. Isaac's step faltered slightly, his eyes widening as he caught her meaning. Florence Reynolds, are you making me an offer? I'm considering possibilities, she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks despite her boldness. The store is well positioned to serve both ranchers and homesteaders. With your knowledge of the valley and my business experience, we could build something important, something lasting. Isaac stopped, turning to face her fully, his expression a mix of hope and wonder. Are you sure? You hardly know me. I know enough, Florence said softly. I know you risked your position and security to stand against injustice. I know you've worked tirelessly to find solutions that benefit everyone, not just one side. I know that when bullets were flying, you shielded a stranger with your own body. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Those are the things that matter, Isaac. The rest we can discover together. For a moment, Isaac seemed frozen, searching her eyes as if to confirm the sincerity of her words. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tender at first, a question rather than a demand. Florence answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened. His arms encircled her waist, strong and secure, as the world narrowed to just the two of them on the dusty road, the setting sun painting the sky in colors as vibrant as the emotions coursing through them. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. I should probably mention that I'm not much of a shopkeeper, Florence laughed, the sound carrying across the open landscape. That's all right, I'm not much of a surveyor, we'll teach each other. Isaac smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. I like the sound of that. He took her hand again, and they resumed their walk toward town, closer now, shoulders touching. As Silvercreek came into view in the distance, Florence found herself filled with a sense of rightness, of purpose. She had come west seeking independence and found something even more valuable: partnership. With Isaac beside her, the challenges ahead seemed less daunting, the future brighter than she could have imagined when she first stepped off that stagecoach. You know, Isaac said as they neared the town limits, people will talk, the respectable new shopkeeper and the man who stands apart from both factions. Let them talk, Florence replied with newfound confidence. We'll be too busy building something new to listen. Isaac's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed that whatever came next, they would face it together. Standing in the middle, perhaps, but no longer alone. As twilight descended on Silvercreek, they walked hand in hand toward the future they would forge together, pioneers of a different kind in a land of new beginnings. The last days of the 2-week truce passed in a whirlwind of activity. With Isaac by her side, Florence faced the remaining negotiations with renewed determination. The incident at Blackwater Ranch had, surprisingly, shifted the dynamic. Holcomb, perhaps impressed by Florence's boldness or simply recognizing the changing tides, approached the discussions with less intransigence. Davis and the association, encouraged by Isaac's findings about underground water sources, showed more willingness to compromise on grazing rights. By the final day, they had reached an agreement that, while not perfect, laid a foundation for peaceful coexistence. Blackwater Ranch would maintain primary access to the existing creeks and rivers, while the association would receive assistance with well digging and water storage systems. Grazing boundaries were established, with provisions for seasonal adjustments. Most importantly, a permanent council was formed: 3 ranchers, 3 homesteaders, and 3 townspeople to address future disputes before they could escalate to violence. It won't solve everything, Isaac cautioned as he and Florence walked back to the boarding house after the final session. Old grievances die hard and there will be setbacks. But it's a start, Florence replied, her arm linked through his. A year ago, would you have believed this possible? Isaac shook his head, a smile touching his lips. "A year ago, I was holed up in my cabin, convinced the valley was doomed to endless fighting. Then a stubborn Easterner walked into the middle of a gunfight and changed everything." "I believe you pulled me into that fight, Mr. Garrison," Florence reminded him with a teasing smile. "A technicality, Miss Reynolds." His green eyes crinkled at the corners. "The point is, you stayed. You faced down men twice your size with nothing but conviction and those remarkable blue eyes." Florence felt warmth rise to her cheeks, still unused to his frank admiration despite the deepening of their relationship over the past week. Their courtship had progressed with the accelerated pace common to frontier life, where dangers and hardships tended to forge connections more quickly than in the genteel parlors of Boston. Mrs. Abernathy, of course, had noticed immediately. "Well, it's about time," she had declared when they returned from their walk that fateful evening, their clasped hands and glowing faces telling the story without words. Since then, she had appointed herself unofficial chaperone and enthusiastic supporter, her practical advice and occasional meddling delivered with genuine affection. As they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Abernathy herself met them at the door, her usually stern expression softened by excitement. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd eloped to Tucson." She ushered them inside. "How did the final meeting go?" "Agreement reached on all major points," Isaac reported. "It's not perfect, but it's workable." "And Marshal Thornton is drafting the formal document now," Florence added. "Everyone will sign tomorrow at noon." Mrs. Abernathy's face broke into a rare, wide smile. "Well, that calls for celebration. I've been saving a bottle of good brandy for a special occasion, and I can't think of anything more special than peace coming to this valley after all these years." As the older woman bustled off to gather glasses, Isaac turned to Florence, his expression growing serious. "Speaking of special occasions," he began, reaching into his pocket, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Florence's heart quickened as he withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Around them, the boarding house seemed to fade away, the moment narrowing to just the two of them. "I know it's fast," Isaac said, his voice low and earnest. "By Boston standards, probably scandalously so. But out here, we've learned that life is uncertain, precious. When you find something worth holding on to, you don't wait." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a simple gold band with a small, perfect sapphire that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the window. "It was my mother's," he explained, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes that Florence had rarely seen. "One of the few things I have from her. I've carried it for years, never expecting to find someone I'd want to give it to." Florence's breath caught in her throat as Isaac took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Florence Reynolds, I know you came west for independence, not to tie yourself to a man with nothing but a small cabin and big dreams, but I'm asking anyway." His green eyes held hers, steady and sure. "Will you marry me, build a life with me here in Silvercreek or wherever the future takes us?" Time seemed suspended as Florence looked at this man who had changed her life in ways she never could have anticipated. The careful plans she had made before leaving Boston running the store alone, building her independence, proving she didn't need a husband to succeed seemed distant now, like a path not taken. "Yes," she said simply, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Isaac Garrison, I will marry you." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant and transformative. With gentle reverence, he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed meant to be. As their lips met in a kiss that sealed their promise, Florence felt a sense of homecoming deeper than any she had known. This was why she had come west, not just for independence, but for the chance to find a life, a love, a purpose that would never have been possible in the drawing rooms of Boston. Mrs. Abernathy's return with the brandy and glasses interrupted the moment, though her beaming smile suggested she had witnessed enough to understand what had transpired. "Well, it appears we have 2 reasons to celebrate," she declared, setting down her tray. "Peace in the valley and a wedding on the horizon." News of their engagement spread through Silvercreek with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By the following morning, When they arrived at the church for the signing of the peace agreement, they were met with knowing smiles and congratulations from townspeople, ranchers, and homesteaders alike. The signing itself was a solemn yet hopeful affair. One by one, the representatives of each faction added their names to the document Marshal Thornton had prepared, formalizing the compromises they had fought so hard to reach. Holcomb signed last, his pen scratching across the paper with deliberate strokes. "Well, Miss Reynolds," he said as he straightened, his eyes moving from Florence to Isaac, "it seems you'll be changing your name soon. I trust Garrison here will make an honest woman of you." "As soon as possible, sir," Isaac replied, his arm protective around Florence's waist. Something like grudging respect flickered in Holcomb's eyes. "Eleanor will be disappointed," he said, his voice lower now, "but I believe she suspected this outcome from the moment she saw you two at the ranch." "I hope she finds happiness," Florence said sincerely. "She deserves nothing less." Holcomb studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. "My daughter has her mother's resilience. She'll be fine." He extended his hand to Isaac, a gesture that caused a ripple of surprise through the onlookers. "No hard feelings, Garrison. You made your choice and it seems to have worked out for the best." Isaac accepted the handshake, his expression guarded but civil. "For all of us, I hope." The moment felt symbolic, a personal reconciliation mirroring the larger peace they had forged for the valley. As Holcomb moved away to speak with Marshal Thornton, Florence leaned against Isaac's solid warmth. "I'm proud of you," she murmured. "That couldn't have been easy." Isaac's arm tightened around her. "Easier than you might think. The past is the past. It's the future I'm interested in now." He gazed down at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. "Our future." That future began to take shape with remarkable speed in the weeks that followed. With peace established in the valley, business at Reynolds General Mercantile flourished. Ranchers and homesteaders still maintained a certain distance from each other, but they no longer avoided the store for fear of confrontation with the opposing faction. Florence and Isaac worked side by side, expanding the store's inventory and services. Isaac's knowledge of the land and its people complemented Florence's business acumen and organizational skills. Together, they transformed the modest establishment into a true center of commerce for the growing community. Their wedding took place 1 month after their engagement, a simple ceremony in the same church where they had helped broker peace. Mrs. Abernathy served as Florence's attendant, while Seth Miller stood up with Isaac. The church overflowed with well-wishers from both factions, a testament to the bridges they had helped build. Florence wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had ordered from Tucson, with her mother's lace veil that she had carried all the way from Boston. Isaac, almost unrecognizable in a new suit and freshly trimmed hair, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such wonder and love that Florence felt tears prick her eyes. Their vows were simple but profound, promises to stand by each other through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. When Reverend Palmer pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to shake the rafters of the small church. The celebration that followed at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house united the town in a way nothing else could have shared: food, music, and dancing, bringing together people who had been enemies just weeks before. Even Holcomb attended briefly, bringing a gift of fine crystal glasses and his reluctant blessing. As twilight fell and the festivities continued, Isaac drew Florence away from the crowd into the quiet garden behind the boarding house. "Happy, Mrs. Garrison?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood beneath a cottonwood tree strung with paper lanterns. "Completely," Florence replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm still getting used to the name, it suits you." Isaac pressed a kiss to her temple. "Almost as much as you suit Silvercreek. You know, when you first arrived, all fine manners and Eastern sensibilities, I didn't think you'd last a month." Florence laughed, remembering her own doubts. "Neither did I in those first terrifying moments behind the wagon, but now." She looked up at him, at the face that had become as dear to her as her own reflection. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else, or with anyone else." Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their new beginning, tender yet passionate, a perfect balance like the partnership they were forging together. Music from the celebration drifted out to them, a lively fiddle tune that had everyone inside clapping and stomping. Isaac drew back slightly, a mischievous light in his eyes. "What do you say we slip away?" he suggested. "The cabin's all prepared, and I don't think anyone would miss us for a while." Florence felt a blush rise to her cheeks, along with a thrill of anticipation. They had decided to spend their first nights as husband and wife at Isaac's cabin, now their cabin, before moving permanently into the renovated rooms above the store. "What about our guests?" she asked, though she was already imagining the peace of the small homestead, the privacy it would afford them. "They're enjoying Mrs. Abernathy's punch and Seth's fiddle playing. They'll be at it for hours yet." Isaac's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "Besides, I've been waiting all day to have my wife to myself." The word wife sent a pleasant shiver through Florence. "Well, when you put it that way, Mr. Garrison, how can I refuse?" They slipped out through the garden gate to where Copper waited, saddled and ready. Mrs. Abernathy's doing, no doubt. The night was clear, stars blanketing the sky above them as they rode together, Florence seated before Isaac this time, cradled securely in his arms. The cabin welcomed them with the soft glow of lamps that Isaac had lit earlier in the day. Fresh flowers stood in a jar on the table, and new curtains sewn by Florence during the wedding preparations hung at the windows. It was still simple, still modest, but it felt like home in a way Florence had never experienced before. As Isaac closed the door behind them, a sweet tension filled the air. They were alone now, truly alone as husband and wife for the first time. Florence felt a momentary shyness, despite the kisses and embraces they had shared during their whirlwind courtship. Isaac seemed to sense her hesitation. With gentle patience, he built up the fire in the hearth, poured them each a small glass of whiskey, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "We have all the time in the world," he said softly, touching his glass to hers. "No need to rush." The whiskey was smooth and warming, easing the nervous flutter in Florence's stomach. As they talked quietly about the day, about the faces they had seen at the wedding, about their plans for the store, the initial awkwardness dissolved into the comfortable intimacy they had been building since that first day behind the wagon. When Isaac finally set aside their empty glasses and drew her into his arms, Florence went willingly, her heart full of love and trust for this man who had changed her life so completely. His kisses deepened, igniting a fire within her that matched the one crackling in the hearth. With tender reverence, they discovered each other fully for the first time, learning the language of touch and whispered endearments that would bind them together through all the days to come. In Isaac's strong, gentle arms, Florence found a passion and fulfillment she had never dreamed possible, a connection that transcended the physical to touch something profound and lasting within her soul. Afterward, lying in the circle of his embrace with her head pillowed on his chest, Florence listened to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Outside, the night sounds of the valley created a peaceful symphony, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft rustling of wind through the junipers, the occasional nickering of Copper in his corral. "What are you thinking?" Isaac murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Florence smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking about beginnings, how sometimes they look nothing like what we expected." "Disappointed?" he asked, a hint of playfulness in his voice. Florence propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at his beloved face in the firelight. "Quite the opposite, Mr. Garrison. I came west looking for independence and found something far more precious." She leaned down to brush her lips against his. "I found you, I found us." His arms tightened around her, drawing her back to his heart where she belonged. "And we've only just begun," he whispered against her hair. Florence closed her eyes, safe in the knowledge that whatever the future held, whatever challenges the frontier might bring, they would face it together. No longer caught between rival factions, but standing united in the middle, building a bridge between worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the vast Arizona sky, bearing witness to a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love born in danger, forged in adversity, and destined to flourish in the rich soil of the land they now called home. Silvercreek changed over the years that followed, as did the lives of those who had shaped its destiny during that pivotal summer. The peace established between the factions held, though not without occasional tensions and disputes that required the mediating influence of the council they had formed. Florence and Isaac's partnership flourished, both in business and in their personal life. Reynolds and Garrison General Mercantile became the heart of the growing community, expanding to include a post office, telegraph service, and even a small lending library stocked with Florence's books from Boston and others ordered specially from San Francisco. The living quarters above the store underwent several expansions as their family grew. Elizabeth Ann arrived first, a strong-willed daughter with her father's green eyes and her mother's determination. 2 years later came James Gilbert, named for both Isaac's father and Florence's uncle. The youngest, Sarah Grace, completed their family 3 years after that, a surprise blessing with a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met. Isaac's surveying knowledge proved invaluable as the valley developed. The underground water sources he had championed became the foundation of an irrigation system that allowed both ranches and farms to thrive side by side. Holcomb, grudgingly at first but with increasing enthusiasm as profits rose, became one of the strongest supporters of the collaborative approach to water management. The children grew up knowing both worlds, riding with the Blackwater hands during Roundup, helping with harvests on the homesteads, comfortable in the saddle and behind the counter of the store. They absorbed the best of both their parents, Florence's education and refinement balanced by Isaac's practical knowledge and frontier skills. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Florence with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. They left the children with Mrs. Abernathy, who had become a beloved grandmother figure to them, and traveled by stagecoach and then train to the coastal city. The grand hotels, theaters, and restaurants of San Francisco delighted Florence, but she found herself missing Silvercreek more than she had expected. By the end of their week away, she was eager to return to the life they had built together. "Did you ever think you'd prefer a dusty frontier town to all this?" Isaac asked as they stood on the deck of a ferry, watching the sunset over the bay on their last evening. Florence leaned against him, his arm warm around her shoulders against the cool sea breeze. "Never. But then, I never thought I'd run into the middle of a gunfight, mediate a range war, or marry a stubborn surveyor with a cabin in the hills either." Isaac laughed, the sound mixing with the cries of seagulls overhead. "Life has a way of surprising us." "The best kind of surprises," Florence agreed, turning in his arms to face him. At 34, Isaac was more handsome than ever, the lines at the corners of his eyes and the touches of silver at his temples only adding character to his strong features. "I wouldn't change a moment of it." His expression softened as he gazed down at her. Not even that first terrifying day, especially not that day. Florence reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours she had come to love so deeply. "It brought me to you." Their kiss, there on the deck with the wind in their hair and the sun setting behind them, held all the passion and tenderness of their first embraces, but with the added depth that comes from years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges weathered together. When they returned to Silvercreek, they found the town buzzing with excitement. The territorial legislature had approved funds for a proper schoolhouse, and the railroad had announced plans to extend a spur line to serve the growing community. Progress was coming, bringing new opportunities and changes that would test the balance they had worked so hard to establish. "It won't be the same place in 10 years, Seth Miller observed one evening as he and Isaac sat on the porch of the store, watching their children play together in the street. Seth had married the schoolteacher from Tucson and now served as head of the town council. Sometimes I wonder if we're losing something valuable as we gain all these modern conveniences. Isaac considered this as he watched 8-year-old James teaching Seth's daughter how to spin a lariat. Change is inevitable. But the things that matter, community, cooperation, looking out for each other, those can remain if we choose to preserve them. Inside the store, Florence was closing up for the day, her capable hands counting the till and recording the day's transactions in the leather-bound ledger that had once belonged to her uncle. Through the window, she could see Isaac and Seth on the porch, their children playing nearby, and felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was what she had helped build, not just a business or a family, but a community where former enemies could sit together on a summer evening, watching their children play without fear. Where a woman from Boston and a solitary surveyor could forge a life together that enriched not only themselves but everyone around them. As twilight deepened into dusk, Florence called the children in for supper. Elizabeth, now a serious 10-year-old with her nose perpetually in a book, came reluctantly, marking her place with a ribbon. James bounded in with the boundless energy of an 8-year-old boy, full of tales about the lizard he had caught and released. Little Sarah, just 5, clung to her father's hand, chattering about the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Their home above the store was filled with the controlled chaos of family life schoolbooks and toys competing for space with Florence's business papers and Isaac's maps and surveys. The dining table, expanded twice over the years, bore the marks of daily use and the occasional art project gone awry. It wasn't the life Florence had envisioned when she left Boston, proper and ambitious and certain of her path. It was messier, more challenging, infinitely richer in ways she couldn't have imagined. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Florence found Isaac on the small balcony they had added during the last renovation. He stood looking out over the town, now outlined in the soft glow of kerosene lamps from windows and the occasional lantern along the street. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her cheek against his back. Isaac covered her hands with his own, drawing her around to his side. "I was thinking about that day, the gunfight, how close I came to riding past without stopping." Florence shivered slightly at the thought. "Why did you stop? You never really told me." Isaac was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I saw your face. Just for an instant before the shooting started, you looked so determined, out of place, yes, but not afraid. Just focused on what you needed to do." He smiled down at her. "It intrigued me. Then when the bullets started flying, instinct took over." "Thank goodness for that," Florence murmured. "Though I'm not sure intrigued is the word I would have used for your expression when you landed beside me behind that wagon. Exasperated might be more accurate." Isaac laughed softly. "Well, you were a complication I hadn't planned for, but the best kind as it turned out." He drew her closer, his arm warm around her shoulders. The very best kind. Below them, Silvercreek settled into the peaceful rhythms of night. From the saloon came the faint sounds of piano music and laughter. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Along Main Street, shopkeepers closed up for the night, exchanging greetings as they headed home to their families. It was a far cry from the divided, tension-filled town Florence had arrived in all those years ago. A town where a woman caught between rival factions had found her voice, her purpose, and the love of her life when a cowboy took her hand and stood with her in the middle. "No regrets?" Isaac asked softly, echoing the conversation they'd had many times over the years. Florence smiled up at him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. "Not a single one." As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, the future stretched before them, a future they had helped shape through courage, compromise, and the kind of love that builds bridges where walls once stood. It wasn't always easy, this life they had chosen, but it was theirs, forged in fire and strengthened by each challenge they faced together. And in the end, that was all that mattered.